to the afternoon session, the closing session of this conference. My name is Rainer Hagenbeck. I'm the coordinator of the ARANET SIN on nano safety. And the topic of this closing session is, or the title, Putting It All Together Towards Standardization and Regulation. And with respect to this, it's my pleasure to announce the first keynote of this session by Tom van Teunenbroek from the Dutch Ministry of Health and Environment, and he will present the NANoREG project, which just today has started. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Slight correction. I'm from the Ministry of the Infrastructure and Environment, and I used to be in charge of the program of health and environment. Now I changed horses. As of today, NANoREG 1, as it is called, is officially started. I got a grant agreement from the Commission, and to my big surprise, I saw that several millions have been put into a bank account as well, so they really want us to start as quick as possible. So far, so good. First, I want to give you a background to what I've been trying to achieve already in a time scale of about 3 years' time. What is NANoREG? NANoREG is nothing more than a regulatory effort and research combination for the European Union. But it's more than that, and that's something I try to explain to you. At the moment, it's, according to the Commission, a flagship with almost 60 partners, 10 EU member states actually, and 3 associated states outside. So Norway, Switzerland and Turkey are also part of the project. Quite a lot of regulators, toxicologists, researchers, and luckily also industry is participating into this. It's a 42-month project because we can't make it any longer. But in reality, of course, this will take at least 48 months and probably more realistic up to 50 months. It's my task to coordinate this, as I will be doing this together with a team of people and also be supported by quite a lot of people from the RIVM, which you know quite well. People like Adrian Sips and Fleming Cassé. What's the aim? The aim is to address the priority question for the member states' national legislators. And the national legislators, mostly the work is channeled through JRC, the different work packages, and lots of aspects come into place like characterization, dosimetry, exposure issues, in vivo testing, in vitro testing, life cycle, and eventually safe by design will be, well, not dealt with, but given the start. The wider scientific and technical objectives are to provide legislators with a tool for risk assessment. The biggest problem is, as we've seen over the last few days, that we're doing quite a lot of work. And I don't say that the work you're doing is wrong. The problem is we don't know how to validate the work in a regulatory sense. If we can't repeat the work you've been doing, if we don't know what the homeostasis, which we're cutting out because we're going straight to in vitro, is really doing with regard to particle toxicology, we really don't know whether we have a problem with safety or not. And at the same time, we are not hopefully going saving the baby and not throwing it away with the washing water. Because nanomaterials, as I'm convinced, is the future also for environmental problems. It will be an innovation for process industry, and not only for product improvement. But we have to make sure that we're not making the same old mistakes like in the past, like in DDG or PCB or whatever else we have as a due to an accident created new policies and specified policies on. So we're here to develop long-term new testing strategies. And we're here to establish a collaboration between authorities and industry. The problem, what we are encountering, is that most of the information industry is having, they're not willing to share. Why they're not willing to share it? Because it's a highly competitive game. So lots of the stuff which makes it interesting, us for toxicologists, but also for legislators, is the same thing which the competition of the companies would like to know. Because once they know, then they know how they can make it as well. And there we have a double game in that I can't tell, but he can't tell either. And at the same time, I can't ask. And there's no way in between in order to get the game starting. So what we need is some new level of trust. Trust between partners on how we can share information in a secure way and at the same time come to a reasonable judgment. Now, the impact, the regulatory disciplinary approach will be for 3 stakeholders. The regulators, which you all know, in most of all the scientific discussions are never present. And you know why? Because regulators have a saying which is very much like doctors. They're better roughly right than exactly wrong. And that's exactly the opposite of what scientists are. They want to be exactly, whether it's wrong or right. And of course, doing a regulation or an assessment and eventually a ruling on a substance, which is always very, very common type of approach. It's just a traffic light. REACH only gives you a traffic light. The product is allowed on the market, the product is allowed on the market under restrictions, or the product is not allowed. And there's no other flavors left. So we have to think in regulatory terms, do we really have to curb a product? Or is it such a big problem? Or compared to all the other problems in the world, how big is the problem in real terms? Of course, lots of people are interested. The biggest interest actually was from China. They even offered me 20 million to participate. Not on a personal basis yet, but would be nice. Russia has been stepped up to plate up to 10 million as well. We already have a preliminary association treaty with Australia with regard to the environmental phase with dissolvable nanoparticles on the zinc oxide, where they have done quite a lot of work. So they'll be very helpful and willing. And there's, of course, the close relationship with the USA. I will come back to that later. The commitment of industry for such a project, which is so big, is essential. So we have luckily found quite a lot of companies or organizations of industries who are willing, or at the moment still reflecting whether they are able to participate. BASF is one of the biggest in here. They contribute up over 4 million euros into a long-term carcinogenity in vivo study. SAFIC is going to set up an industry advisory board, but apart from that, they're also going to give us a long-range initiative call, which we can say what we would like to get for that money. The Finnish pulp and paper industry is there to deal with their nanocellulose approach. Bayer is going to do 2 things. One, they're going to look into carbon nanotubes, of course. But the other thing is, I don't know whether you know, but Mr. Paulungen, head toxicologist of Bayer, has the so-called famous dust hypothesis, claiming that nanoparticles are nothing more than dust and don't need any extra attention. Well, he has quite a lot of references and done quite a lot of experiments. So we said, why don't you prove it within our program? And luckily they said yes. So this is going to be interesting. Of course, some people from Spain, Belgium as well, and there are also some Dutch companies, and I just talked to Unilever, who's going to be interested in this process as well. Now, let me turn you back to the background. Why did I do it? Because everybody knows there's something like the OECD, and the OECD has a working platform for manufacturing nanomaterials. It started in 2006. I was there. And in 2007, the policy side within the Commission started as well, which is called the Competent Authority Subgroup of Nano. That's the CASG Nano. Now, the abbreviations are manifold, but the problem was also manifold, because all the discussions are separated in so many different subsets by subgroup of people. Even though they represent the same country, they didn't speak the same language. And they didn't even come at the same conclusion. And it was remarkable that in such different platforms, same countries contradict their own positions in different platforms. Now, luckily, the Netherlands is small. So in terms of coordination, we've got a very tough coordination. So meaning that when I or my colleague from the Ministry of the Economic Affairs or the Ministry of Health or whatever, everything they're going to say there is coordinated up front in whatever platform they're going to deliver the message. So that message can be, of course, changed a little bit, like now, but 90% of that message which we are spreading within international organizations is coordinated throughout the whole cabinet. And not just by one guy in the Ministry of Research thinking, we should go left, and then someone else in the Ministry of Health say, we should go right. That's not possible in the Netherlands. And that's something I think which we desperately need if we want to clean up this mess with regard to the regulation. Now, I told you before, industry was very reluctant to cooperate and to share information, especially in those days, 2006. Those were the heydays of self-regulation. That was before the Lehman Brothers, and everybody thought industry did it better, knew it better, and we government shouldn't get any experts because the expertise was outside. So you have to keep that mindset into yourself as well. So what's at stake? What at stake is that we have to determine additional requirements for the so-called REACH dossiers. At the moment, nanomaterials are registered, if they want, voluntarily under REACH. That's only possible because we just recently made a definition of what a nanomaterial is. Legally, if there is no definition, you cannot make any registration possible of a nanomaterial because legally it doesn't exist. So there are quite a lot of stumbling blocks in the whole process of going into regulation. Science was already there, they did their thing. Of course, everybody's know the Faber-Oberduster review in 2006, I recall. And then we had the Royal Society report. And then we had lots of reports which was more or less re-quoting those reports for 90% over and over and over again. The Sennier report, then we got the EFSA report, then we got many reports, but the same message was always over again. We don't know, and we have to judge ad hoc, meaning case by case. Now for a regulator, dealing with substances on a case by case basis is horrible, because then the amount of work is going to the roof. And if you have just one substance like silica, it's simple. But then if you have to deal with nanosilica and then 25 different forms and shapes, do I have to register for each of them a separate registration, yes or no? Is that relevant with regard to the safety profile of the substance? So the real question is not what requirements do we need, but the real question is what is the minimum set that I can request and still have enough information to make an assessment. So it's an optimization question, because this is all about money. This is all about interest, and it's all about expenditure. Has nothing to do so far with safety yet. Then the CAS Nano deals with the legal relations. So they deal with the question, under REACH, you're only obliged to register a substance if you produce more than 1,000 tons per year. Now, for most nanomaterials, nobody produces 1,000 tons a year. Of course, the retrograde redefinition of the nanomaterials definition meant that carbon black suddenly became a nanomaterial. And it's the most prominent nanomaterial in the world. It's 80% in terms of volume and mass of production. But we're not really interested in carbon black, are we? And then, of course, carbon black, which was a big shortage in World War II. So Hitler said to his scientists, invent something new to get my synthetic rubber tires turning, because my war has to go on. Then he invented nanosilica, which is called also in the German white soot, because it was used for car tires. So, and those two materials are in bulk the real bulk materials of nanomaterials production. Then you're talking about thousands of tons. All the rest is probably less than a ton, maybe 10 tons. Titanium dioxide, of course, that's still a big production as well. But all the other ones, it's still small. Then the legal question comes, do we need to register this? So do we have to make a provision in the legislation that if there is a nano registration, does then the requirement of 1,000 tons still abides? Or do we need to lower that? But those kind of questions are legal questions. The other questions we have to deal with are the harmonized instruments. Harmonized instruments are dealing with the so-called MAD concept. MAD means mutual acceptance of data, meaning if you do a test in Korea and you do it according to these guidelines, anywhere in the world they have to accept the result of that test. That's only also to do to reduce costs and not to get inhibitory aspects with regard to export and import of products. This is where the OECD comes in. The OECD is the organization in the world who sets these so-called MAD guidance. So, at the moment, what's the situation? The Commission is rather unclear. There's some infighting between different sections of the Commission. They don't agree about whether REACH is sufficient, whether there needs to be a nano patch in the legislation, and whether there needs to be done something special, which is then called a lex specialis. The other thing is, of course, that in Horizon 2020, which is the new policy for the new FP8 program, and for which all the budget wars you've seen on your television last month, nanotechnology is seen as one of the 6 key technologies. These are one of the technologies which should pull Europe out of its swamp and help to make it more innovative and create more new jobs for a more technical, developed society. That's the vision. Horizon 2020 aims at a reindustrialization linked to knowledge-based economies, driven by innovation. And therefore the arguments between all parties, the Commission, enterprise, environment, the member states, the chemical industry, really have to be resolved. Otherwise, you will never get there where you would like to go. So currently the number of patents in the European is still high, but the production is outsourced. So in terms of patents, we produce in Europe about 40% of the patents on nanomaterials. In terms of production, we produce less than 10%. So this is still a chance to restore this link, and this is actually the objective of the politics in general. So what we need for future regulation and dossier requirement can be seen as a strategic approach to safeguard the link between the nanochemicals, its application, and its enabling technologies. Because if you have a key technology which all the technologies like ICT, life science, and nanotechnology as an enabling technology, nano is taken out. The other 5 don't work as well anymore because it's seen as a complete package. So for this, the EU has gone on to a tactical alliance with the US. And for this purpose, the US erected together with the EPA and NIOSH, as well as the so-called Nano Initiative, the EU-US Communities of Research approach, of which I'm also heading that research approach for the regulatory community aspect. NANoREG has been awarded this, and more or less where we're trying to get new market conditions and safeguard the EU innovation and prosperity. So to you it might look like, where the hell have I gone now to? What is this to do with my science? Well, this is what your science is hopefully bringing to the table. This is the bigger picture you have to see with regard to what you're doing in your laboratories. Next, please. So, that was the background. Now the question comes, what are we going to do? First, I'd like to focus on something else. How we're going to do it. Because what we see in most FP7 projects, it's funding, it's bottom up. There's a goal, there's an idea, there are people, they write call papers, you know it all, everybody loves it. Working all through the night and the final deadline 5 minutes before you. Luckily we can enter it now digitally, but before the old days you still had to go to Brussels because you didn't trust the courier to bring it on time. I lost a project through a flat tire of a courier once. Those were the days. But if you want answers for regulatory purposes or for policy aspects, it means you need to have demand-drivenness inside your project. So it means I have to be quite a tough type of coordinator. I'm a kind of coordinator who tells you what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. It means we will set standards within our own experimentation. We will have standards of operation. You are only allowed to work with the materials we are going to select as a group. Whatever else you would like to do beyond that, you can do, but if you don't do it with the materials and the methods we agree upon, you're out. Very simple, straight and forward. Otherwise, if I don't start to reduce the clutter at the front, how at the end of the project can I ever see a signal-noise ratio which will be statistically really something? We've seen the statistics up to now from the database, and it's a disaster. And from a regulatory point of view, it means it is non-valid. It's not even a discussion. Of course, there's lots of discussion, but it's mostly political, it's mostly about interest, and it's mostly about impact. So, how are we trying to resolve this? Well, one, we're going to collect and evaluate all existing data from ongoing national, EU, and international sources. Luckily, OECD has stepped up to the plate, especially with regard to guidance, with regard to experimentation on sample prep, sampling, dosimetry, and dose metrics. They just released a new report which used to be like 12 pages, which was more like think about it and be aware of that. Now it's more a full-grown document with about 112 pages with quite descriptive ways of how you should apply and do your experimentation in order to maintain a certain quality within your experimentation so they can be compared afterwards and be compared between experimenters. Then the other thing is we have to define the boundaries of the projects. Which fields are included, which fields aren't. That means food is out. Food is so important, of course, but if you really go into the food discussion with regard to the definition, all proteins could be labeled as nanomaterials. So the biggest problem there is then how to discriminate between manufactured nanomaterials versus natural nanomaterials and how to see a different differentiation with regard to impact of both of them. We will look, for instance, into food packaging and the use of nanomaterials in there. Pesticides are out as well, nanopesticides and stuff. That's because pesticides are strongly regulated to its own legislation, so we don't deal with those aspects. Then we make a gap analysis for those identified nanomaterials where regulatory and testing input is needed to give additional guidance. Meaning, if you look at the old sponsor project of the OECD, I don't know if you're aware of, this is a program of about $80 million. The main idea was to build safety dossiers of 15 common nanomaterials, most used. So you had cerium oxide, you had silver, you had zinc, you had gold, silica, titanium, carbon nanotubes, you name it. Everything was almost there. But they're like the first generation nanomaterials. So we didn't talk about coated materials, we don't talk about self-assembly. We just talk about the main discussion which has been going on and on and on. What is the problem? What is the primary particle? Is the primary particle a realistic worst case objective? Or is the cluster really the worst case from which you have to start? And it all depends in relation to the question, what is a realistic exposure scenario? and what exposures are realistic with regard to biokinetics and uptake. Because if it doesn't get there, how wonderful your research in vitro might be, I just am not interested. It's very simple. If it can't get there, it's no problem. 4, agree on test methods based on relevant data. Then we have to establish a forum. Because the biggest problem, what we see in most research projects, is that you might reach a conclusion, but then what are you going to do? Well, if you're a researcher, you hope to get new money, you go on and do more research. But have you ever checked whether the facts which you have generated, if somebody did something to them, did it have an effect? Lots of times nobody does. Lots of times nobody cares, because that's your job. You're a researcher. It's my job to take those 2 results and do something with it. It's a big problem, because the conclusions reached in scientific discussions is not the same as conclusions in political arenas or in regulatory forums. So what we need to do, we need to bring the conclusions of the researchers outside the NANoREG project into the arena of the people who really decide that these data are to be trusted and are to be used with regard to the assessment of the risk. And then we have to agree upon storage data and management from the project, because lots of data will be generated. If you are going to do 60 million research, which is more or less 55 million worth of research, you're hopefully going to generate a lot of data, but it's also very challenging to make them accessible, and make them accessible for all the partners as well. And so we will have also a very strict regime with regard to how you can utilize, exploit, and have to publish your data within the group and outside the group. Of course, it's still your data, still your right, but like we've seen in OECD, where somebody is just sitting on his data for 6 years before sharing it, is something which we can't allow in this project. So we have to ensure open and transparent dissemination. So these are the required cooperation between the main players. So we have industry on the side, there's a science aspect. Industry also, of course, talks to risk assessors, and industry also talks to policymakers. And then, of course, we've got the wild card, which is called you and me as a consumer, or an NGO member, or maybe somebody who doesn't agree with it all and becomes a member of a political party and starts a political party against nanoparticles. There is one in Thailand, I can tell you. Now, then we have the scientists. What we're going to do, we're going to deal with the development with the reduction of the methodology. So we're not going to look in NANoREG for what is the safety of the material. We are going to look at, are the tests we have to assess the risk of chemicals applicable to nanomaterials? And if not, how can we amend them that they become? Because the question for a politician is not whether something is safe or not unsafe. You know, we all drive cars, well, most of us, and then we go to a petrol station, and then we tank petrol. Quite dangerous. We still do it every day. So it's all about how do we manage that risk under a normal situation. So it's not only about the question of saying, okay, this is bad or this is wrong, or this is okay, but it really means about how can I reduce the uncertainty question, because the real question nowadays is like, can I trust the data? And we've seen it here since the last few days, and especially also the statistic discussion here this morning, that the database is quite sketchy. It's very hard. Data to be repeated, the experiments to be repeated, it's not really there. And that's because if you look at nanotoxicology, we've got about 100 years of science behind us. So we can interpolate and we can extrapolate. In particle toxicology, it's still a new game. And there's an awful lot of distribution issues which are assigned to the toxicology aspect as well. Meaning we need to go more on an interdisciplinary approach we as toxicologists, I think, have lost the way to think in chemical terms. I think there needs to be much more chemistry involved in the whole discussion with regard to regulatory issues of nanomaterials, not only toxicology driven, should also be physics, material science, and chemists. Because if we just simply put stuff in assays and then afterwards we're trying to interpret what the effect actually might be, or how I could interpret what the results could be on a bigger scale in the world, then we have a real problem. Then we're not solving a problem, but we're creating problems. And you know, politicians hate one thing, and that's the word uncertainty. So, the other thing is, for the risk assessors, they need a secure risk assessment strategy. At the moment, it's not there. And then, of course, we have to get information requirements. That means the regulatory settings. How are we going to change the laws that the data that we need, we will get in order to make the assessment? Well, this is all mumbo jumbo. Short. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to get the credibility as a regulatory context up. Therefore, we do quite a lot of in vivo work, and which is mostly related to the so-called REACH implementation projects of Nano. I don't know whether you know this, but this is a huge project which has been a battlefield between member states, scientists, competent authorities, and industry with regard to what is the value of your science, as we have shown it here today, or in the last 10 years overall. What is it? What's the value? Is it really credible? Can we use it? The other thing is we have to go into accelerating the regulatory process, because we're still dithering about these primary particles and first generation nanomaterials. But if you look in the real world with the multi-coated walls, and like yesterday Jerome showed beautifully, those specially coated hydrophilic phobic type of titanium aluminum coating around titanium dioxide. Wonderful, but that's the real world. So are we studying what is really relevant for risk assessment, or are we just studying because we like to know how the interaction works? For a regulatory aspect, of course, we need to know what is relevant for the real world. Then there's here what we hope to try to achieve is to get some scientific answers to the whole regulatory issues. I'm not saying I can solve the whole problem, because the problem is also political, and it's also dealing about interests. But the other thing is about keeping pace with innovation. You know, time to market in a laboratory of say, Dow Chemical or DuPont could be at the moment something from 9 months, meaning an invention on the bench to a product to be sold, 9 months' time. The regulatory process to assess something is usually up to 2 years for one substance, and some of them are longer. So this discrepancy is just moving along. We're somehow utilizing regulation as a kind of policy end of pipe measure to make you all believe that the world is safe. Of course, the world isn't safe. And what's really happening is that products are sold on the market while we really don't know, as governments, how to assess them and what the safety is. Now, this is something I would never say out of the theater, out of here, but that's the reality of the question. And then, of course, when you start to do that, you run risks. And the same risk you run, and we have run, with, for instance, genetically modified organisms, and the way it's been dealt with in Europe. And now look at what's happening in terms of science outside Europe compared to what's happening inside Europe. I don't want to happen that to nanomaterials as well, like it happened to the GMOs. So, what are we going to do? We're going to set up a specialized data platform The data platform is linked to the way that the REACH dossiers have to be filed. It's called the Euclid database. The Euclid database is a database set run and exploited by JRC, and that's for normal chemicals. And now they made an additional one with more lemmas, so you are able to put more data and more different data in. That's they call the NanoHub portal. Now this is the thing I'm really most interested in from a policy point of view. The current situation is almost like this. You've got something in R&D, there's an innovation going, there's a market, and eventually there's a regulator coming, I allow it or I don't allow it, and then we have safety. Now hopefully in the near future, when REACH is really starting to work, because REACH only is functional for the last 4 years, so it's not really, going there. If REACH keeps on going in the tempo we're doing it now, we're finished in the year 3087. So it's quite a paper tiger in terms of getting it all done. It's not realistic in terms of achieving it within, say, for instance, 25 years time span or so. No, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years given the amount of workload. So you can tell that the people at ECA who deal with that are not really looking forward to deal with every nanomaterial on an ad hoc basis, because they've got plenty of worries with regard to the other chemicals as well. So, but REACH is really trying to do the opposite. First R&D, then we deal with safety. Safety has data has to be delivered by industry, and then it will be allowed on the market. The nicest thing is, of course, if you get a real future where you have a responsible implementation in which the R&D is integrated the safety. And that would be nice if you could redefine or know which chem parameters with regard to nanochemicals can predict something about their possible effects. But for that, we need to know much more about the behavior of nanoparticles, their clustering behavior, their, you could say, geology. Because what's happening to those particles is very similar to what geologists study from a volcano, the granite, all the way through the life cycle. Only the time frame is much longer, hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. With nanomaterials, it's a bit faster because they're smaller, they're more reactive. But what's happening to the particles in terms of clustering, agglomeration, and changing is something we need to know as essential. But it could also be used to make it safe, like we've seen yesterday with the titanium dioxide. A beautiful solution with regard to keeping its ROS capabilities down by coating it with the aluminum. Wonderful. Whether it's safe enough, that's a whole different discussion. But it's already an example of how you can make something a lot safer than people fear. Now this is my last slide. Of course, I'm going to have all sorts of working groups. There's going to be an industry consultancy group. There's of course a toolbox in the end. Who doesn't have a toolbox in the call at the moment? Then there is a specialized IPR advisory board. Then there is a regulatory advisory board. And here's the data platform of the NanoHub, which then hopefully is going to link into the whole REACH dossiers in ECA. Now, there's also a relationship between me and all the national coordinators, meaning that every country who is participating in NANoREG will have one coordinator whose job it is to have an integrated response with regard to the position of a country, with regard to the scientific results we are generating in NANoREG. So that if we are going to propose to change a guideline for instance in OECD or an ISO definition or whatever else, you always have to implement that through a member state. You can't do it as a scientist. You have to be a state. And only states are members of these organizations. So this interface is actually the guys who have to start implementing the results we are hopefully going to generate within the project. And where are they aiming their arrows at? That's like ISO, OECD, CEN, Caracal, which is also a body regarding legislation of chemicals in Europe. CAS Nano is a part of it. The Strategical Research Association, and there are lots more, ICUS, IDEO, DOTA, nomenclature, ontology. But the biggest problem is we have to start working in a systematically ordered fashion. So we have to predict with regard to if we are going to generate statistically valid results, how many experiments do we need to do? It's very simple. It's like the Latin box you ever studied a long time ago about how many animals should you use in order to get statistics which really have a meaning. This is the type of laborious work we have to do. So in that sense, we are not going to do groundbreaking research. We're going to develop and redevelop methodology and make it reliable. That's the hope. I could go on, but I have to stop. One of the biggest questions is, of course, the grouping of the nanomaterials. Why do we want to group? We want to group them because then ECA can deal with them as a group in one dossier instead of a case by case. This is why we want to group. Nothing else why we want a group. It's only to reduce the workload. But the problem is, what are we going to test? What are we going to test? So the biggest problem with grouping is, of course, do we have any kind of hypothesis-driven experiments in which we can discriminate certain questions and test them against each other differentially? Like, if you have an aspect ratio aspect, then you should look for like fibers which are non-dissolvable versus dissolvables and do the experimentation. Or you can have to look into dissolvable metals. The same question with, of course, silver being a kind of intercellular injection of silver ions. Is it the same for zinc oxide? Is it the same for other dissolvable metals? Well, you could test it against undissolvable metals. And that type of testing, in the end, is not going to get real new scientific breakthrough, but it gives us some solid ground to move forward. That's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview on the background and the objectives of NANoREG. And the floor is open now for questions. Any questions? I have one concerning the timeline.
Yeah.
Is there any expectation or estimation on when we will have this regulation on nanomaterials?
You have to split it. If you talk about the legal questions with regard to the legislation on REACH and whether we will have a lex specialis or what they sometimes call a nano patch, nobody knows. Up in the clouds. There won't be any movement until we get a new commission. That won't be done until September. Then, of course, we have to deal with one of the biggest producers of nanomaterials in the world, and that's Germany, who is also going through elections. So, before we will see any movement on there, at least 2 to 3 years before you see in what heading it might be going. On the instrumentation, meaning guidelines from OECD and such, they are much further ahead. We are now already based on, for instance, the inhalation toxicology horizontal group, which we reorganized 3 years ago, going to amend several guidelines on inhalation of OECD guidelines to have a special lemma saying mind you, if you do this type of experimentation or this guideline with nanomaterials, you have to deal with your sampling, your dosimetry, and your handling of your materials in such a way. So it's in terms of instrumentation, I think the guidelines change will be a continuous process. It will be done at least, I think, in hopefully 5 to 8 years' time. But I think the whole regulatory issue of nanomaterials in order to move on and be more of a business as usual instead of a highly politicized debate, I would estimate 10 years. That's a reality.
Thank you very much once again. There's one further question.
Yeah. The only one. Yeah. 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 So yeah, it means that there's an awful lot of effort from the scientists going on with regard to cleaning up the mess, making it more solid ground. But there's also going to be an awful lot of effort with regard to regain trust between partners like regulators, industry, and governments. There's going to be an awful lot of discussion and lots of communication and lots of workshopping between national partners as being national coordinators and their respective member state organizations like OECD, like CEN, like ISO, like so. Of about the 60 million in total we have, I would say at least 5 million is spent on talking. Yeah, and it sounds wasteful, but it's the only way to move forward because it is such a dynamic situation. It's more or less you have to convince each other. So it takes a lot of preaching and you have to have a lot of data. And that's what I hope to provide both.
Any further question? Okay, thank you once again.
Thanks.
We now move on to the last keynote presentation because